Welcome to the Albuquerque Journal's Tech Outlook podcast. CNM is truly one college with infinite possibilities in tech and data sciences. CNM offers programs where everyone can learn about software, apps, or how to build websites. You can also choose from AI programs and machine learning, the Internet of Things, and so much more. CNM, one college, infinite possibilities, and the proud sponsor of the Tech Outlook podcasts.
Welcome to another episode of Business Outlook, a podcast hosted by the Albuquerque Journal Business Desk. My name is Megan Gleason, and I'm a reporter here at the Journal. Today with me is Kevin Lorenzen, who's going to talk to us about an interesting subject called EHS. Kevin, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Tell everyone about yourself.
All right. So I actually am in the insurance industry. I've done that for about 18 years. But prior to that, I spent 25 years. I affectionately refer to it as my quarter century in the semiconductor industry. So my background is all engineering. So I have an engineering degree and an MBA. Did that for about 25 years and moved over to the insurance industry. So part of what we'll talk about today probably is more reflective of my prior career, but looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. And so we're here to talk about electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS. It's a really interesting condition, so tell me about it.
So it's not real well known yet, but I think there's going to be a lot more people that are going to be affected. They probably are affected by it. They just don't recognize the symptoms yet. So electromagnetic hypersensitivity is really driven by people's, really their effect of electromagnetic fields on them. So I like to use ultraviolet radiation as an analogy because I think people get that. So everybody knows that if you hang out in the sun for 8 hours out on the beach, you're probably going to get burned, right? But if you have a much darker skin tone, right, more melatonin, or if you happen to be Irish and just came off the boat there, two people can be at the same beach for 8 hours. One person is going to be severely burned. The other person, maybe not so much, and they're okay. Same amount of what we would refer to as ultraviolet radiation, and we all get that. So electromagnetic radiation is what comes from electrical fields, magnetic fields, comes from radio frequency radiation, right? So we'll talk a lot about cell phones, about Wi-Fi, about cell towers, because those all literally are emitting radio frequency radiation. So that is really what's driving people's sensitivity to those technologies and then the development of EHS. The interesting thing is that EMFs don't necessarily cause EHS. What they do is they actually have a biological reaction. So it really goes down to the cellular level, so intracellular, intercellular, and we can get into the big details of it. But essentially, the electrical, magnetic, and RF fields, dirty electricity as well, so harmonic distortions, will affect the cells and cause what they call a voltage-gated calcium channel to open up, flood the cell with calcium, and then it's going to create inflammation and then really all different types of biological, endocrinological issues within people's bodies. So kind of crazy, but it really is. It's very complex, so you don't really think about it a whole lot. But if we look at ultraviolet radiation, understanding that some people are going to be affected, some not so much. When you look at people who are on the spectrum of EHS, same thing. There are going to be some people who genetically just can't handle this toxic burden because it really is an environmental effect causing a burden on their bodies, which is a toxic burden. Some people are going to get affected by it much more readily than others. Some people may be able to hang out in a complete Wi-Fi environment in front of cell towers all they want and maybe not show as many symptoms as somebody who is easily affected by it.
Yeah, very intriguing to say the least.
Sure.
And you don't have EHS yourself, right? But your wife self-diagnosed herself and a natural doctor later diagnosed her as well. So can you tell me about the symptoms that led to that?
Sure. And when we started looking at her health over the course of really probably the last decade, she had some symptoms, but you really didn't know that it was driving toward EHS. So it wasn't until probably she reached more of the toxic burden that it really became an effect for her, or had an impact on her. She was driving her car one day, so I think I'm okay saying she had a Lexus, hybrid. So she had an RX, and she was driving the car and got to the point one day where she literally had to pull the car over, park it, and called me and said, there is something wrong with this car. She said, I cannot drive it. She said, it's literally giving me a heart attack. She goes, my heart is pounding and my brain is burning. And she goes, when I get in the car and turn it on, it's bad. When I get out, I'm better. So that really kind of told us something. And so we started looking and saying, okay, what is causing this, right? Why would a car cause this? And so when we got into the, a lot more of the literature, and it's amazing, right now there are thousands and thousands of peer-reviewed papers written by scientists, written by doctors, MDs, and so the information is out there. It's just that you don't see it readily available. So we kind of had to research it a little bit, and sure enough, found out that she was sensitive to pretty much anything that was electrical, magnetic, or RF, radio frequency. So those were all having an effect on her body. And so we did. We literally, it took us about 6 months before we really understood what it was. And apparently that is just lightning speed, because some people who suffer from these symptoms may have it for 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. Sometimes people have it for literally a decade, and they don't really know what's going on. They just know they don't feel well, across a wide spectrum of different symptoms.
Yeah. So how does your wife cope?
Oh, gosh, that's probably a really big question there. So it's amazing. So we've had to do a lot in our own house in order to make it safe for her, or safer. So we tried to do as much in terms of reducing the magnetic fields, electric fields, anything which is RF. So starting primarily first with the Wi-Fi router, we got completely rid of our Wi-Fi router. We went to a wired router and modem. So it's old school. It's like we used to do, right? So we now have literally cables going everywhere, right? So we're using Ethernet cables. And so we wired our house with about a half a dozen different rooms that have an Ethernet cable. And so if we're going to use a computer or use a phone, the phone actually would always be on airplane mode, but we can still access the phone and use it like a tablet or a laptop. We would use the Ethernet. So we do not have any Wi-Fi in our house whatsoever. We got rid of every single smart device that we possibly could. So we had a couple of smart thermostats. They're gone. We got rid of the Ring. We got rid of just about every one that we could, other than a washer and dryer. And then I did my best to disable those signals. But it's amazing because so many of the appliances that we have these days, even down to coffee pots now, are Bluetooth, right? So you can literally wake up in the morning and make your cup of coffee from the bedside and have it ready in 30 seconds. So we got rid of all that. We were actually doing some work on our house, and so we were able to rewire quite a bit of it, and we made it much safer. So we have electrical meters, magnetic meters, dirty electricity meters, RF meters. And so by utilizing all of those different meters, I was able to find areas of the house which were causing her problems. So we did a lot of that. We also keep about 40% of the breakers in our house are turned off. So there's literally no electric current going through any of those wires throughout the house. So we're roughly half the breakers are on.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot of measures.
It is. It is.
Yeah. And you mentioned this before, that there's data, there's peer-reviewed studies, but still medical doctors and federal officials say that EHS isn't scientifically linked to EMF or radiation. So
Sure.
Can you speak to that?
I can, and it's interesting because the FCC right now is standing by essentially guidelines that have put in place back in 1996. And so they are so completely outdated. Because when you think of any technology, right, if you're working for Intel, you know that you're going to have a new chip come out every 18 to 24 months. And that technology continues to change. So we're looking at guidelines that were put in place back in 1996, so 28 years ago, and they have done nothing to change those. And so the first part of that is, sure, it's 2.5 decades old, but the guideline that they had in place is strictly based on what they call a thermal effect, right? It's only looking at the use of a cell phone and how much that cell phone heats up over a period of time. So if you're using the cell phone, you've got it next to your head. Is your ear going to warm up? Is your brain going to warm up? What effect is it from a thermal standpoint? So they've never, ever addressed what the radio frequency radiation is that is emitted from a cell phone. When you look at other countries, right? So if you look at Switzerland, if you look at France, most of those companies or countries rather have specific guidelines in place for how much emissions can come from a cell phone. In fact, France banned the iPhone 12 a couple of years ago because its emissions were too high for what the standards were in place in France. We have none. So the fact that the FCC says it's okay, you have to question whether or not they're really doing their job. So they were ordered back in 2021. They lost a case, and one of the federal appeals courts said they have to, number one, answer why they've refused to acknowledge the data that's been out there for decades now, why they refuse to acknowledge that data, why they refuse to accept the fact that it shows harm, right, to not just people, but our entire environment as well, right? Because plants and animals, they're affected by this just as much or as easily as people. So anyhow, 3 years ago, the FCC was ordered to go back and review what its guidelines were and actually put in place specific requirements on the regulations that we should have for radiation emissions, and they've done nothing for the last 3 years. So it's as if they keep stonewalling and not doing what they're supposed to do, right? The FCC is supposed to protect us. The government is supposed to protect us. So why is it not protecting us? Why is it just saying we're not going to do anything in regards to putting in guidelines or safety guidelines, right? There's no limits currently in place.
Yeah. So what do you want to see happen from a state or federal level like the FCC?
So I think at some point, we have to say there needs to be some kind of a guideline in place. We have to put something in which is going to look at, number one, a long-term health study of the effects of this technology. So if you look specifically at Wi-Fi, right, cell towers, Wi-Fi in the houses, right, they're all connecting to your cell phones, your tablets, your laptops. Cell phones, I mean, they were literally, the first call was made back in 1973, but it took a decade before there was really any infrastructure. I was an engineer at Motorola. I worked in the RF wafer fab. We made radio frequency devices. So the first original cell phone that was commercially available came out in 1983. Again, it took a while before people started to purchase them because they weren't necessarily affordable. They were $4,000. So people have had cell phones out now for for over 40 years, almost 41 years now. And the effects of those are starting to have, they're apparent, right? So people like my wife have shown how it can affect her. And they state that in a lot of different papers, there's about 3 to 5% of the population worldwide, so it's a global issue, that are affected by it at a very intense level. But nearly 30 to 50% of people in the global population have some symptoms. But they don't always know that. So I think the first thing is we have to look at a long-term health study and be very specific in terms of what those emissions can be, right? Not just looking at the thermal effect, right? So as crazy as that 1996 guideline is, they used what they called SAM. SAM stands for a specific anthropomorphic mannequin. SAM just happened to be about a 6 foot, 225 pound male, which puts Sam at 95th percentile in the entire world, right? So we were just talking about people's height. If you're less than 6 feet, you're going to be less than what Sam was. When they were using Sam in order to see what the thermal effect was, but never even looked at what the radio frequency emissions were. So we're using a completely outdated guideline. So we have to fix that. We have to see what the health effects are. We don't generally roll out a new technology and just proliferated throughout the entire world. But we've done that with cell technology. So we are now on 5G. So when the first cell phones came out, they were actually analog back then. Now they've gone to digital. But that was 1G. So we've gone through 2G, 3G, 4G, right, LTE. Now we're on 5G. They're already talking about 6, 7, and 8. But nobody has ever studied what is really happening to people, what is happening to animals, what's happening to plants. We always talk about the climate, but yet we haven't done a single thing about what's going on in terms of just rampant Wi-Fi signals, right? I mean, every time you look up and down the street, you'll see more and more cell towers just being placed everywhere, right? You see them now, sometimes they're, 50, 60 feet tall. They'll have 3, 4, sometimes even 5 layers of transmitters and emitters on them. So that's all affecting us continuously, right? You can't escape it any longer. So I think we really need to press the government and maybe even technology companies, right? So those who are creating these phones, those who are creating the ability to access the Wi-Fi anywhere, anytime from a cell phone, a tablet, a laptop, whatever device it is, and probably put some specific guidelines in place for our young kids, because when you start looking at how young people, talking about the 95th percentile, right? People who are smaller, we're generally talking about adults. But what about young children? What about the babies who are in their mom's womb and mom has a tablet or a laptop sitting right on her belly while she has a child growing inside of her? So I think our children are probably getting affected by it even more. Data show that they have much thinner skulls, so they're not going to have as much protection for their brains from these different types of signals. Certainly a different amount of moisture in their bodies, right? So they're not as easily able to to be in the middle of these signals and not have it affect them like we are, right? I mean, fully grown, we're not going to be affected by it nearly as much as a growing child. So.
Yeah. And you and your wife have really talked about wanting to raise awareness for these kinds of things.
Correct.
So what would you recommend that people do in their daily lives to sort of lessen their exposure to radiation?
Sure. There are a lot of communities right now that are putting in fiber optics. So fiber optics, that's kind of the next great area, right, in terms of being able to handle more data transmission. So fiber optics, it's kind of, I guess it would be somewhat equivalent to maybe using Ethernet, right? But if you go to fiber optics, it's going to be much safer. It's going to be much faster. It's not as easy to hack as well. But we can get a lot more data transmission by using fiber optic. And people should go to wired. We have so much that we think has to be wireless, right? I mean, all of our headsets are wireless. We have the wireless coffee pots. We've got, the smart thermostats and smart ring, right? All of those. Not everything has to be wireless, right? What was wrong with being wired? So for my wife, we were talking earlier about some of the things we've done for her. Literally, she uses her computer almost no time throughout the day. But if she has to go on the computer, we've done a lot of modifications to it. So we've literally removed all of the guts from it, including the cooling fan. So even if she wanted to use it, she really can't use it for much more than about 5 or 10 minutes because it'll overheat. But we've removed pretty much everything from the inside of it, especially its capability to connect to the internet. She has a wired mouse now. She has a wired keyboard. So those don't give off any kind of an RF signal. But if you have a Bluetooth mouse, if you have a Bluetooth keyboard, those are giving off an RF signal, and they're right there. Think of all the people that have cumulative trauma disorders, and it could be from those simple exercises of the repetitive motions, but how much of it is really being caused by a mouse that's Bluetooth connected or a keyboard that's Bluetooth connected, the fact that they have a Wi-Fi connection on their computer, right? So they're literally getting impacted by a computer that is generally within their touch, and then also within close proximity. So we've changed all that for my wife. And then she stands in front of her computer, and we literally have about a 4-foot stainless steel wall, if you will, between her and the computer, with essentially 2 very tiny holes drilled out of it so that she can look through it. So she literally has a stainless steel wall between her and the computer screen, and that's how she's able to use it. But again, very, very limited amount. So completely different than what you would see in any normal working office environment where everything is pretty much wireless and everything is Bluetooth.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how data and research progresses on this as technology just keeps ramping up and up and up.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate the time. Hopefully this was interesting, and I'm always happy to answer more questions about it in the future.
Yeah, definitely a very different subject. Yeah. To everyone watching, thank you so much. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, which is abqjournal.com. You can also find them on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to our print edition or an online subscription at abqjournal.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and read, hear, and watch.